I don't want to lose our Reformed distinctiveness. But at the same time, we don't have to lose the Reformed distinctiveness if we allow other cultures and ethnicities to come and worship with us. It's how you utilize those differences to still preach the gospel. And I get off of my high horse there. All right. So the next question is, what is the proevangelium? That's the first gospel. What's the first gospel?
Proevangelium. Yeah. So this relates to the larger discussion of thinking through kind of that suzerain vassal treaty we were talking about earlier, that in the Garden of Eden, what ultimately happened there was a falling away from our role as being lesser kings and overseeing the world. And so this proto-evangelium, the first giving of the gospel, God comes at the very beginning of that narrative in Genesis 3. Adam and Eve are in shame and in guilt, and they've bowed down to the false king. And God makes a promise right there at the very beginning, Genesis 3:15, where he says, one is going to come and the snake is going to strike at his heel, but ultimately he's going to be the one that crushes the snake's head. And it's a reference to Jesus Christ, and it's right from the very, very beginning. This is unfolding. And the reason why I reference that in the paper, and I think it's important for us to understand, a lot of people have heard that term. A lot of people understand that happens in Genesis. But again, by the time we get to Jesus and his death and resurrection, we are thinking in Matthew 28, okay, now the Great Commission begins. And again, it puts the impetus on us. It says, like, we, the church now, God has given us a mission to go forward, but it's a reality. No. You are being invited into and empowered by the Spirit now, after Jesus' resurrection, to continue the mission God already started in Genesis 3. We already knew this was coming. This is not a surprise. This isn't plan B. And so, some of why I think that's so essential is we are living increasingly in a time where mega churches here in America especially have a greater influence than they should in many of the lives of believers. And we've got a number of them, including I referenced like Andy Stanley, who's starting to suggest that maybe the Old Testament is not so relevant for us anymore.
Yeah.
And I think it comes from a very dispensational mentality that says we are only New Testament believers. And I say, when you do that, you divorce yourself from the full weight of the calling of missions that God gave us in the very, very beginning, because this is not some story that we all of a sudden show up in the middle of Matthew's gospel.
Right.
This is going on from the very beginning. This was God's plan. And it changes the way that we think about how we're interacting with the mission of God. Again, something that we're designing, something that we have thought of, or is this something that God has called us to? And ours is more of a response than it is to be thinking about how it is that we can do something for God, as much as it is that he's redeemed us for the purpose of working alongside him in a mission he already began.
Right. And I want to go off on a small tangent. I'm not going to stay on it long, but
do it.
I had two friends. One was the roommate, and the other one was a very close friend of mine. It's my friend's wife. And my roommate and I were talking about the Old Testament, and he made the comment that the Old Testament is not needed. It's not necessary.
Yeah.
And I hear that so much, and it's like, ooh, like you people don't understand. And I actually ended up referencing Genesis 3:15.
Great.
And that was totally me not knowing what I was doing. But I went there to prove a point. You say that the Old Testament's not necessary, but then if you read Genesis 3:15, you get this. But also, let's go ahead and take a look at the prophets. Who's the prophet that clearly saw Jesus before anybody else? That was Isaiah. Okay. Right. When you look at Elijah and how he built this altar, and people don't see Jesus in that, but I do. The simple fact that God sent down his fire to consume the entire altar, even the water. Okay, Jesus was our fire. He is our fire. That's pointing to Christ. When you take a look at David, okay, David is in the direct line of Jesus Christ. Points to Christ. Everything that he does, even his sinful activity, points to something greater.
Yes.
So you can't just come on as a new believer and just jump into the Old Testament, because you will miss the entire point of the gospel.
Yeah. And the writer of Hebrews is doing that same exact thing. He's writing to a group of Jewish people who have said, hey, this is harder than we thought it was going to be. It's cost us a lot to become Christians. We're going back to Judaism. And so he's going to take the entire book to show all throughout the Old Testament, throughout every ceremony, throughout every every law, the temple, how everything, Moses himself, David, all of these were types and shadows of the reality that was to come, which all of this pointed to Jesus. Jesus himself said that, right? He's on the road to Emmaus, and he walks those disciples through and shows them all the places throughout the Old Testament where it was really about him, you know?
Yeah,
And I think that's, go ahead.
My favorite story in the Old Testament that points to Jesus is when Isaac was taken up to the mountain.
Mm-hmm.
All right, which is roughly, you can
Yes.
literally look and see the mountain of Golgotha where
Yes.
Jesus was going to be crucified.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You know, it's like, come on, like, how can you not want the Old Testament? Like, that sets you up for the new covenant,
That's
if
right.
you will.
That's
You know,
right.
you have to get the old covenant to get the new covenant.
That's right. That's right. No, I tell people that all the time. The best commentary on the New Testament is the Old Testament.
Yeah.
And especially you get into apocalyptic literature. There's no possible way to understand the book of Revelation unless you have spent time in something like Daniel. There's just no way to do it.
Right.
So, yeah.
Right.
Good stuff.
All right. So my next one, Stephen, is this. And this, again, is a personal question for you.
Mm-hmm.
So how have you seen the Great Commission in your field of work? I know that's a very stupid question.
No.
Since
no,
you
it's
are
not,
a
man.
missionary, but
No.
I want my listeners to kind of get a sense of, you know, what the Great Commission is in your field of work.
Yeah, that's great. So, and it's actually a really important question for our specific field of work, because even within World Outreach, our mission arm here in the EPC, we early on got that question. When we think of missions, and we would be the first to say, this is what we promote more than anything else. We want the gospel being preached, church planting, front lines, unreached people groups all over the world. We are all about that. That is an emphasis of ours as well. We realize that in order for that to happen for generations to come, so we often think about not just the first generation church, but the second, third, and fourth, is that there's an essential aspect of giving the full gospel that includes equipping. And so we emphasize that the Great Commission is not just go therefore and baptize in my name, but then it also says, and teaching them all that I commanded. And so for us, for ITEN, the International Theological Education Network, that's our role in it. And we think it's important. And again, we go back to the fact that Paul says, I planted the seeds and Apollos waters. We're waterers. That's what we are. And we work hand in hand with our missionaries on the field in World Outreach that are doing the frontline work, that are sharing the gospels, that are gathering people into home churches, that are planting churches. And then we play a secondary role where we come in. But you know, historically, as the church has gone out and has put an emphasis on church planting all over the world and unreached people groups, what often has happened is that within a generation or two, they've gone back to folk religion. They've gone back to atheism, whatever it might be, because the roots haven't gone down very deep. And so I think the idea that we would just hand over the keys of the kingdom, so to speak, to a national and say, we're done, to another church, is just unfaithful. And so we're trying to do something. So that's our specific role in the Great Commission. And the way that we're seeing that play out is that we're seeing churches that are really, they're doing battle against, I think, one of the greatest enemies of the church right now is the prosperity gospel. You mentioned that earlier, especially in the places where we're seeing it in poor countries, third world countries, majority world countries, whatever you want to call it, around the world. We are seeing that's infecting the church in ways that, like, we see it here in the States for sure, but in places where the church has just begun is very, very vulnerable. Is very vulnerable. And you can imagine in places like Liberia, it's like the fourth poorest country in the world. When you've got people that are selling on the street corners a $5 bottle of miracle water that promises to bless your house and to give you wealth. In Indonesia, I've seen churches that have given away cars for people that have given the most money that year, like just insanity. And so you've got these faithful pastors that we're gathering with, and they're asking very honestly, how do we combat this? How do we compete against this? Because they'll tell you, like, evangelism is happening. God is calling people to himself. The church is exploding. And the greatest hindrances to their ministry is not people who are standing against the gospel or people who are like radically Islamic or Hindu or whatever it might be. It is fellow Christians who are preaching a false gospel. That's the hardest thing. So I think our role in this day and age, as the church is exploding, is even more important. That we're in a time in a season right now where with exactly what ITEN is doing is essential to the Great Commission. And we've got to play a supporting role and we got to play a training role. So,
Amen. Good point.
Yep.
Okay, so How has the Great Commission been a struggle for you over the years? I don't mean to
I
get
think,
personal.
no, that's good, man. It's good. I mean, I'll tell you, I definitely, I was sort of a late bloomer in thinking about missions, thinking about the Great Commission. I definitely would have been a person who had relegated missions to a particular position in the church, a particular calling. I was in the halls of academia. I was sort of a stereotypical ivory tower guy who was concerned with my books, my lectures, my papers, my publications, all of those kinds of things. And missions was this subject. So I worked at two different colleges, and both of them had a missions department with missionaries off the field who were teaching missions classes. I wasn't one of them. I taught practical theology. I was about preaching. I was about hermeneutics. I ran the chapel program. I was in my own little world. And when I got the invitation from Bruce Anderson to sort of say goodbye to all that and use those gifts and experience on the behalf of the world who did not yet have it, it was a struggle. It was a real struggle. And what I found, and I think this is true for a lot of people, not just me, but to like enter into God's story requires a loss of, or kind of a confrontation with all the other idols in my life that have competed for my identity.
Wow.
So I would say more than anything else, entering into the Great Commission fully and say, I'm going to give myself to this fully. I'm going to live off the support of other people. I'm going to have to ask for financial assistance. I'm going to go to places and where I am always the minority. I don't know the language. I don't know the custom. I'm going to feel very uncomfortable. I'm going to live on planes and in airports and away from my family for this task. To do all of that, it was an amazing sense of a loss of identity. I built my world around being Professor Steve Woodworth and the things that I could contribute to the academy and my post and where I went to school and where I was working at school, and this whole false world, which I think for many of us, we don't even recognize how much of an idol it is until it's taken away. So there was a gift in that for me. And yeah, to be honest, a total struggle. I thought, well, who am I now? Who am I now? Because I'll tell you what, people in sub-Saharan Africa don't really care where I went to school. And they certainly didn't read my journal article in the Westminster this month. So they do not care, but what they do care about is that, like, I'm a fellow Christian, and I have come to share in the fellowship of Jesus Christ and to use whatever gifts that I have on behalf of strengthening their church. That's what they care about. That's what they care about. So there's a beautiful part of it. There's been the sacrifice up front, but I tell people all the time, I get to sit in the front row of what God is doing around the world every day. Every day I'm on the phone with folks in Albania and Siberia and Vietnam, and just hearing the stories, about the visions God's giving people, the explosion of the church in those places. I'm hearing stories of persecution, overcoming persecution, friends and folks that are being beaten for the faith and yet rejoicing and coming out of prison and continuing to plant churches. Like, it's an incredibly exciting ride. And I feel like I'm right on the front edge of like where God is pushing his kingdom right now. So it's worth it. It's all worth it.
Amen. Ooh, amen.
Yeah.
All right. So tell me this, and this is for anyone that is seeking to be a missionary. So for one who is seeking to be a missionary, how can they overcome their obstacles and challenges of the prescription of the Great Commission? And the reason why I use the word prescription is because the Bible prescribes us that we have to do something. We have to do the Great Commission. You said it best. This is how God set it up. Okay?
Yeah.
So how can one overcome the obstacles and challenges of the prescription of the Great Commission?
I think, one of the things that probably helped me the most, and this is something that people should be doing whether they're thinking about missions or not. One of the greatest gifts I think we've tried to give to our children is we have introduced them to the biographies of great missionaries that have gone before us.
Amen.
It's been an incredible discipline. And it's one of the things that eventually began to change my own heart. My wife, Carrie, was a cross-cultural studies major. That's where we met in college. She was planning on being the missionary in our family. She thought she was going to Africa. That was her heart. She became a mom and faithfully, raised these three boys with me. And one of her heart's desire was, if it's not my calling to go, then maybe it's going to be one of my kids. And so I'm going to give them this gift of like telling the story. And so from a very early age, we just began reading the stories of Hudson Taylor and William Carey and Helen Roosevelt and like just incredible people, Amy Carmichael. men and women that have given it up because there's something very difficult for us to